Professor Terry Wilson.
Hence the blank slide. Thank you, Matt, for inviting me. It's an honor to be among such distinguished company, to wish Alan all the best and to commend him. Some of you might have had this experience. Normally, in one-day affairs like this, if you're the last speaker, it's pretty much a dead end. You've got an eminent, witty, engaging audience. Prior speakers have said it all, certainly all the things I might have wished to say, and probably would have said it better and in a funnier way. But that's a typical situation. And there's nothing typical or average about Alan Kazdin, as we've heard today. So, when you're talking about Alan, he has done so much. He has made so many contributions. He is unique, that if we had this audience and others, and we all collectively gave talks, I doubt if collectively we would still really do justice to the impact and influence he's had on the field. So, a couple of slides. I wanted to make this more informal. I have two substantive points I want to make, and then I'll get to some personal reflections. And the two substantive points are Alan's decisive influence, one, on the beginning of behavior therapy, and two, on what I predict will be the future of not just behavior therapy, but evidence-based psychological treatment in general. And many of you have covered all the things in between. So in terms of the beginning of behavior therapy, in 1978, Alan published a book, History of Behavior Modification. You won't be shocked to know that it was not a bestseller, but I have a few things to say about it. It is a remarkable volume. It epitomizes scholarship, critical thinking, and all the positive features that have been documented today. The book was commissioned as part of a series by the National Research by the Committee on Brain Sciences of the National Research Council in 1969. This was the third in the series, and the idea of the series was to try to draw on recent scientific findings and laboratory research, basic research, in order to try to improve the treatment of, quote, nervous and mental disorders. That was a long time ago. And Alan was invited to write this book. And it's extraordinary. First of all, it's a very detailed, accurate history of the beginning of behavior therapy, which technically dates from about 1958. And so he had begun work on this only about 12 years later. He describes all the developments in South Africa, in England, and of course the United States. And given my South African background and friendships with pioneers in the UK like Hans Eysenck and Cyril Franks, I was in a position to know just how accurate and detailed this was. He had read everything. Yes, there wasn't as much literature then as there is now, but still an extraordinary feat. In the book, he covered various theoretical origins of the field, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, the rise of applied behavior analysis. He commented on cognitive and self-control approaches. It was only at that time in the early 70s that, as we used to say in the field then, psychology is going cognitive. He included all of that. For good measure, he had a chapter on legal and ethical implications of this research. Not exactly a typical endeavor of anyone writing. And the final chapter, chapter 11, this was a book of over 400 pages. The final chapter, epilogue, colon, future directions. And I'll just say that he was prescient, as I'll get to in a minute. So in terms of moving ahead to the current cutting edge and the future of evidence-based psychological treatment. There's pretty broad, this is something Tom Insel said as he was coming to the end of his term at NIMH. Two major challenges, scientific and clinical challenges facing us as we move ahead. First, we need to close, and I like the way he chose this word, the unconscionable gap between what we know and what we do. And that's global, and it certainly also applies in the United States. And that's what Alan most recently has called the treatment gap, the discrepancy between people who are in need of mental health services and the ones who get it, let alone get high-quality evidence-based treatment. And second, as Insel said, we don't know enough. And what he meant by that, and there's pretty good agreement on this, is that even our best evidence-based treatments, sometimes difficult to say this, even in the areas I've worked in all my life, even in our randomized controlled trials under those controlled conditions, leave a lot to be desired. Lots of people go essentially unimproved. We need to improve on the best that we have, and or we need to develop new treatments. So starting with that, what will we do to really improve upon what we do? And this is one area in which Alan has made a huge contribution. It's come up today. There's widespread agreement that we need to know more about mechanisms or mediators of change. Everyone seems to be, we've been saying that for a long time. It turns out that we know relatively little. There's a reason for that. It's challenging to do. There are obstacles in doing it. One of my most highly cited papers is one on mechanisms of change, and it's only that highly cited because I'm second author, and the first author is a renowned Dr. Kramer, whose name came up earlier and with whom Alan has also collaborated. And what that paper did was to make the case for the importance of temporal precedence. If you want to talk about mediation or mechanisms, which is still not routinely done, you need to demonstrate precedent of change, which is one of the reasons it can be challenging in randomized controlled trials to do that. Despite that, I do not insist that my graduate students read that paper. Instead, I have them read the single best source, in my opinion, in the field, which is a paper, surprisingly, Alan Kazdin authored in 2007 in the Annual Review of Clinical Psychology. It is a wonderful scholarly review of mediators, mechanisms, moderators, moderated mechanisms, and the like. And it reminds me, I have to get a couple of those slides Wendy showed with Alan's picture between all the arrows showing the relationships between them. And jokes aside, having just spent over the last many years a long time being editor of Behavior Research and Therapy, a leading international journal, you would be surprised how many prominent academics and researchers still don't really get it as to what the difference is between a mechanism and a moderator, let alone mediator and mechanism. It's a very important area. Chances are, if we knew more about that, we would not only have more efficient treatment, but we would have more effective treatment. So moving on to the other topic, how to close the treatment gap, how to reach more people. Earlier today, and I think Nat for one talked about it, made reference to a paper Alan wrote with Blaze, Kazdin and Blaze, 2011, enormously influential, important paper. And one of the, I can only touch on a little bit, but one of the key elements there was his argument about we need to change and develop different ways of delivering treatment. And talked about three particular areas where we would have initiatives. One was greater use of technology, and we've heard a lot about that today. The other two were the use of non-professionals to deliver treatment, and three, the use of different types of self-control interventions. As it happens, over the last 10 years, I've been focused on the latter two, working with Chris Fairbairn in Oxford on developing more cost-effective, scalable treatments for eating disorders, basically versions of what we used to call guided self-help, but we now talk about supportive self-help as opposed to independent self-help. And let me talk about that first. What we've been able to show, despite a great deal of skepticism, and I was one of the original skeptics, nothing like doing something and finding that you were wrong, that we've often got results with eating disorders, except for anorexia nervosa, that equal the best results of the Cadillac treatment for eating disorders, Fairbairn's eating disorders enhanced treatment, which is terrific treatment, but it's fairly complex. Multiple components. It's challenging to train people to use it. It's challenging for people to learn to implement it competently. And those, as we now know, thanks to the work of Alan and others, those are very important limiting factors in terms of closing the treatment gap. We can't ignore them. What we've found and been able to show is that, at least in some instances, much shorter, much more, and I'll use the word scalable, which I only discovered myself some years ago as I started doing globally relevant work. In some instances, it is as effective as the full complex treatment. But more importantly, and emphasizing a point Alan has made from 2011, but as you'll see, well before that, even if you have a treatment that is not as effective as the optimal deluxe treatment, if in fact it produces a certain modicum of change, moderate change, and can reach far more people in a realistic fashion, in routine clinical care, surely that's terribly important. To some extent, that's a public healthcare model, but the first time I really read that in black and white was the point that Alan was making. So this is very important, and to the point. I hope all of you know what the NICE guidelines are that are produced in the UK, National Institute of Clinical Excellence. In my view, by far the best guidelines anywhere in the world, most rigorous, most transparent, interdisciplinary, etc., etc. For many years, CBT has been rated as the treatment of choice for all eating disorders, and even for some subgroups of anorexia nervosa. As of last May, less than a year ago, NICE upgraded their ratings of eating disorders, and they now recommend guided self-help as the initial treatment of choice because of reasons of cost-effective scalability. The second one is task effectiveness. Alan had talked about task shifting, rather. I was fortunate to work with, collaborate with Vikram Patel and his premium research group in India. Basically, what we showed, this was published in Lancet last year, was that a psychological treatment for severe depression, we benchmarked the best results that have been produced in either the UK or the US using non-professional psychologists, non-professional counselors, we call them, many of whom had a high school degree. The key was in the training, and it helped to have Wellcome Trust funding to do the training. There are other aspects about this treatment, not only showing that non-professionals could do just as well, but we trained non-professionals to assess other therapists, and they came to be as effective as supervisors and assessors as professionals. The implications of that for scalability are huge. I don't have time to go into more aspects of that. Suffice it to say that we also showed separate settings were important, and as someone raised today, the importance of avoiding jargon. One of Vikram's great contributions is getting rid of jargon. Basically, the treatment we used, we call here behavioral activation. I'm not even sure all of us as professionals agree on exactly what that is. That became the Healthy Activity Program. It's freely available in a super treatment manual, which perhaps not surprisingly is, I find, difficult to find people in organized psychology in this country to use. On to a more personal note. You'll rapidly recognize the young Alan Kazdin. I'm not sure myself who that person is. standing to the left of him. In 1976-77, both of us were lucky to be invited to the prestigious Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences to be part of a special group to review the development of this new thing called behavior therapy. We joined 4 very eminent people: Stuart Agris, Nate Azrin, Jack Rothman, Walter Mischel. During that year, I learned an enormous amount from all of them. To this day, I collaborate in grant-funded research with Stuart Agris, but by far, what was the most important for me was my collaboration with Alan. Over the course of the year, we wrote one book together, worked on a second one, which we finished the following year, and published separate papers. There's no time for me to really go into what I learned. I endorse all of that I've heard so far today. Suffice it to say, I've never had things better. It was a wonderful experience. A couple of years ago, I went back and looked at the book that was published in 1978. And in chapter 3, written by Alan almost completely, there are a number of comments that, when I pull them out like this, look surprisingly modern. Evidence suggests that non-professionals in general can achieve therapeutic changes and with some training are just as effective as professionals. No one in the world knew what the term task shifting or task sharing was then, but that's the operational definition of task shifting. That's what the premium program in India, published in Lancet last year, demonstrated, documented without doubt. This task shifting is something which, perhaps not surprisingly, encounters quite a lot of pushback by organized psychology in the United States. And this was just one particular aspect of the book, especially in that chapter that Alan wrote about the future. The whole thing about closing the treatment gap, of being scalable, culturally adaptive, acceptable to people, dealing with clinical realities, dealing with different settings. In the study we did in India, there was no specialized clinical center people came to. First of all, none of them had transportation to get anywhere, as a result of which much of the treatment was delivered in their homes by non-professionals, and we benchmarked the best results. It's in the training. Very last thing I wanted to make a comment. So Alan has really led the way conceptually, and in a recent paper, I haven't read the book, but last year in the special issue in Behavior Research and Therapy has a paper on closing the treatment gap. And it's a blueprint for what needs to be done in the future. And it doesn't only involve what I've talked about so far, different methods of delivery. It talks about different treatment settings, the need to take account of that, organizational factors, tremendously important, which we're now beginning to see played out in the IAPT landmark initiative in the UK led by David Clark. These are hugely important. No longer can we possibly just focus on specific treatments shown to be effective in randomized controlled trials in really artificial medical school university settings, just as he's been arguing. And to close on a personal note, I would be remiss if I didn't comment on Alan's sense of humor and funniness. You've all done that today. Who doesn't do it? When my wife and I, and by the way, that year my wife was an intern at the Palo Alto VA with a young Phil Kendall. Yeah, I wondered if it was you when I first looked at it. What a great year. But when we said goodbye, which was sad to say goodbye after such a wonderful year with Alan, my wife verbalized something that I knew, but I hadn't quite put into words about Alan's such a funny guy, sense of humor. And that is how invariably his humor is good-natured. He shares his humor with people. He shares his funniness with people, including you in it. It's never mean-spirited. He doesn't make fun of people. He includes people in his fun. And of course, it's often, as we've heard today, and at times seen, it's typically self-effacing. That's very unusual. A year ago, in a paper in Behavior Research and Therapy, at the end of a terrific paper on closing the treatment gap, Alan saw fit to make comments on our collaboration going back into another lifetime in 76, 77. And he started by, first of all, commenting on the contributions I allegedly made to the book and our papers, being far too generous in terms of commending me for scholarship, etc. But then, somewhat uncharacteristically, he saw fit to comment on what he contributed to the book. And he made a point of emphasizing one particular strength for which he is well known. And that was proofreading. And of course, in the actual article, he misspelled proofreading. So it's been enormously fortunate over all these years to have had Alan as a colleague, as a collaborator, as a friend. It was wonderful. Thank you, Alan.